Thanks, Sydney. Happy Sabbath, brethren. Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being with you all this Sabbath. And again, warm welcome to Wendy. We really appreciate your coming. So today, shoot. So today I'll be concluding the sermonette which I started a fortnight ago, titled "It is Good to Draw Near to God." Okay, yes, that was the sermonette title. It is good to draw near to God. So just to recapitulate, the banner verse was Psalm 73 verse 28. Psalm 73 verse 28. I'll read it in the New King James, just to bring us up to speed. It says, quote, "But it is good for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord God, that I may declare all your works." Okay, so and then in the introduction we talked about some of the benefits of drawing near to God. That, for instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 4 verses 5 to 8, when Moses was giving his final speeches before his untimely demise, he told the people of Israel that God's people anciently then, and of course God's people now, that they should make God's law. They should take God's law to heart, because it will become their wisdom in the sight of the nations, and it will help them be kings and priests to the nations. And then verses 7 and 8 thereabouts, he says, which nation has a God so near to it that they can call upon in any time. So we see here that some of the benefits of drawing near to God is that He's there to offer wisdom, and He can be called upon any time. So that was our introduction. Then from there we developed the word near into an acrostic, or an acronym. And near has 4 letters, namely N, E, A, and R. So we covered the first 2 letters. N, we saw that it stood for navigation, and we saw that, for instance, being near to God gives us navigation in life. We quoted scriptures such as John chapter 8 verse 12, where Christ said He was the light of the world. John chapter 9 verse 5, where again he talks about Him being light of the world. And John chapter 12 verse 46, where again he talks about Him being the light of the world. Then we looked at a scripture such as John chapter 10 verses 27 to 28, where He talked about how He was the good shepherd and He would lead His sheep to the pastures of eternal life in His coming kingdom. So that was mainly the N, or the benefit of the first benefit of drawing near to God, in that He provides navigation. Then the E, in our acrostic, was that He provides encouragement. And I did provide and I did hint at that quote from Sir Winston Churchill, which I didn't have that time, but I now have it. I'll just read it. So Sir Winston Churchill said, quote, "Courage is rightly considered the foremost of the virtues, for upon it all others depend." That's Winston Churchill. I'll just quote him again. He says, quote, "Courage is rightly considered the foremost of the virtues, for upon it all others depend." And then we just went on and looked at how the scriptures seem to vindicate Mr. Churchill, because usually before God would send out His servants on a very important mission or mandate, he would take care to encourage them. For instance, as Joshua was on the cusp of assuming the mantle of leadership of God's people from Moses, we saw that God went out of His way to encourage Joshua, to say, "No, as I was with Moses, I will be with you." We looked at scriptures such as Deuteronomy 31 verses 1 to 8, and Joshua chapter 1 verses 5 to 9. I'll just repeat those: Deuteronomy chapter 31 verses 1 to 8, and Joshua 1 verses 5 to 9, whereby God was telling Joshua that as I was with Moses, I'll be with you. Just be sure to make this word your guide and your wisdom. Be sure to meditate upon it day and night, and act upon it, and you will find good success. We also saw that God encouraged people, His prophets such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel. In Jeremiah chapter 1 verses 7 to 8, Ezekiel 3 verses 1 to 11, He encouraged them before He sent them on their prophetic missions. We also saw that David in the nadir, or the trough, or the low point of his life, he encouraged himself in God. That's 1 Samuel chapter 30 verse 6. 1 Samuel chapter 30 verse 6. And then we also looked at how Romans chapter 15 verse 4 tells us that God saw to that the scriptures were written and preserved because they give us hope and encouragement. That's Romans chapter 15 verse 4. So again, the E in our acrostic is that we should be encouraged, and we are encouraged as we draw near to God. So then we just started on the A of our acrostic, which is astute appreciation of oneself, or appreciation or apprehension or understanding of oneself. And we began by looking at how God knows us more than we know ourselves. For instance, in Matthew chapter 10, verses 27 to 31, we see that God even knows the number of hairs on our head. I don't know if anyone knows the number of hairs on their head. So again, it just shows how much God knows us more than we know ourselves. And because God knows us more than we know ourselves, He can help us get a grip on ourselves, and He can help us master ourselves, both by accentuating our strengths as well as by containing and even overcoming our weaknesses. So we saw that from the beginning, God has helped His servants, and even all people in general, strive to overcome their weaknesses. For instance, in Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 to 7, when anger was getting the better of Cain, God encouraged Cain. He was like, no, you can overcome this. You can get a hold of yourself. You can master yourself. The anger doesn't have to get to you. Unfortunately, Cain didn't take God's advice to heart, and unfortunately, he murdered Abel. So that's where we left off. So we'll just continue now. In Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, the prophet says the following. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. The prophet Jeremiah says the following. Reading from the New King James. It says the following. It says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Then verse 10, just for context, it says, I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. So we see here that God both knows and searches our hearts. Again, it's another indication that God knows us more than we know ourselves. So again, a benefit of drawing near to God is that since He knows us more than ourselves, He can give us inside information on how to overcome these sins which can sometimes get the better of us. For instance, He tells us that for some sins, and I think it's good advice generally for all sins, but for some particular sins, God tells us that we must just flee because the temptation is usually just too great to overcome if we just stand. So sometimes the best way of standing firm and being faithful is to just flee. For instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, from the New King James, it says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. So we see here that God tells us to flee from sexual immorality because He knows that because of course he designed human sexuality, and He knows that if tempted, one stage of the sexual intercourse, or the sexual act, or the sexual drama in a sense, leads to another. There's first holding of hands, then fondling, then penetration, and all that. So we see here that God just says, don't even let the process start. If you're being tempted, just flee, because He knows that one process just segues or transitions into another. So He just says, you know what, just flee, because again, He knows us better than we know ourselves. Also, if we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 14, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 14, In the New King James, Paul the Apostle says, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." I'll just read it again. "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." So again, we see another command, another hint from God, who knows us more than we know ourselves. He tells us that if we're tempted with idolatry, or if we just see something, an idolatrous scenario, he just tells us just to flee, because again, he knows us more than we know ourselves. He knows that that we'll probably rationalize and say that probably not bowing down to an idol, or just this once, or perhaps more so in the ancient world, when they used to involve cult sex in these rather arcane, or rather mystery religions, that have a lot of temple sex, and that'll be one of the rites in the worship of these gods. So God just said, no, just flee, because it's just better for you that way. So again, we see here that drawing near to God, God gives us these hints and these tips so that we don't fall by the wayside. Among other hints and tips that God gives us, for instance, is that He knows that that we may not always have the best sense of time. So sometimes He gives us reminders that we should value our time. For instance, in you probably won't have time to turn there, but Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verses 1 to 5. Ecclesiastes 7 verses 1 to 5. We see here that Kohelet, or the preacher, or Mparidzi Nshwana, he's telling his congregation that that sometimes, if you can, it's good to go to the house of mourning, and because that's where we'll all go. We'll all go to the grave. So sometimes it's just good to reflect and see that that's where we're going, and because when one does that, they'll gain a heart of wisdom, and they won't play around with the time that they have. Because as Psalm 90 verse 12 says, Psalm chapter 90 verse 12 says, when you do that, you'll get to number your days, and you'll use your time wisely. So again, this is God knowing us better than we know ourselves. He knows sometimes that we can get a little careless or carefree with our time, and so He tells us that we should just consider that we'll be going to the grave, so we need to use our time wisely. So again, the A&R acrostic for drawing near to God is that He gives us an astute appreciation and apprehension of ourselves. And just to close off that thought, let's turn to Psalm chapter 19 verse 11. Psalm chapter 19 verse 11. I think it helps us. I think it beautifully encapsulates this point. Psalm 19 verse 11. It says, Psalm 19 verse 11. I'll just read verses 9 and 10 for context, because they'll help provide context and weight to that key verse. So this is from the New King James. It says, quote, "The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yes, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Moreover, by them your servant is warned, and in keeping them there is great reward." So we see here that if we draw near to God by taking His law seriously and doing our best to keep it, our lives will become His law will be sweet to us, in the sense that it gives us wisdom as well as warning. So that's the key. That's the key benefit of drawing near to God, and that's what I was trying to encapsulate in that A of our acrostic, that it gives us astute apprehension of ourselves. So the R, or the final letter in that acrostic of near, is that drawing near to God gives us rapture, repose, and rest. Yeah, I'll just repeat that again. Drawing near to God gives us rapture, repose, and rest. Okay, so if we look at the Apostle Paul in his epistle to the Philippians, we see that he was writing this epistle whilst he was under house arrest. So he wasn't 100% certain what would befall him Especially we see that especially in chapter 1. He wasn't sure whether this was it, whether he would whether whether this was going to be his swan song, and and this was his final epistle to his congregants. So he wasn't sure whether he was going to die a martyr's death or whether he was going to be released and continue working. But we see that regardless of the outcome, Paul was very cheerful because because as he notes in that chapter that that to die that they said, sorry, that to live is gain and to die is Christ. In other words, you're saying that if he dies a martyr's death, in his next waking moment, he would be with Messiah in his coming kingdom, or if he was to be spared, if his life was to be spared, he would continue working fruitfully, helping God's brethren prepare for his coming kingdom. So we see here that Paul was very much at rest and at peace because he was near to God. So yeah, that's a very useful, that's a very interesting window into Paul's attitude because of his proximity to God. We find that in Philippians. Again, we won't have time to turn there, but that's Philippians chapter 1, verses 19 to 26. Philippians chapter 1, verses 19 to 26. You'll find that interesting passage. So again, yeah, Paul wasn't in the happiest of circumstances, but he had this peace about him, and we see more hints of that later on in his epistle. For instance, in Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, and also verses 10 to 13. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. And verses 10 to 13, we see here that Paul is rejoicing. And I think also in Philippians 4, verse 4, he actually says, rejoice in the Lord, or in Shana, Farai Munashe, he's saying, rejoice in the Lord. I just wanted to say Farai because I have a brother named Farai, but yeah, rejoice in the Lord. So we see here that Paul is telling God's people to rejoice, and he's telling them this whilst he's in prison. And he goes on to tell them that, that when you're praying, making requests to God, make sure that you do so with thanksgiving, and he'll give you a peace which surpasses all understanding. And then in verses 10 to 13, he says that regardless of his circumstances, because of his proximity to Christ will give him strength to weather the circumstances. So whether he had a lot in one scenario or whether he was in want, it didn't affect his well-being, his spiritual well-being at least, because he was near to Christ. So we see here that drawing near to God gives us this rapture, this rest, and this repose, and it can be ours. For instance, in Psalm chapter 16, verses 10 to 11, we can turn there if we'd like, but you don't have to. I'll read it. This is Psalm chapter 16, verses 10 to 11. It's a messianic prophecy, but some of it can apply to us. This is so I'll read from the New King James. It says, "For you will not leave my soul in Sheol or in the grave, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption." Then verse 11 is the key verse. "You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." So again, this was a messianic prophecy. This Christ fulfilled this. Well, Peter quoted these two verses in Acts chapter 2. I think verses 28 to the end of the chapter. Yeah, you'll find Peter quoting those verses. So here we see here that Christ wouldn't be left in the grave; he'd be resurrected. And then also verse 11 shows us that then he ascended into the Father's throne, and in his presence was fullness of joy. But here I just want to just extrapolate from there and just say that just like Paul was very close to God, and God gave him a peace and a joy and a repose there. So here we see that if we draw near to God by fearing him, by keeping his commandments, he will give us this joy that surpasses all understanding, and he will give us and he will give us a peace of mind which can face all circumstances in life. And then also, if we continue walking with him and drawing nearer to him, at the end of days, at the Messiah's return, we'll be at his right hand, and we'll enjoy pleasures forevermore in his coming kingdom. So we see here that that yes, indeed, drawing near to God gives us a rapture, a rest, and a repose, which again surpasses all understanding. Yeah, definitely it does. We see here also again just scriptures for reference, which unfortunately we won't have time here, but just scriptures for reference on this point. There's Matthew chapter 11 verses 28 to 30. Matthew chapter 11 verses 28 to 30, where Christ says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. John chapter 15 verses 8 to 11. John chapter 15 verses 8 to 11, where Christ says that that if we do his will, he'll make sure that our joy will be full. So he'll make sure that we're joyful. So again, from these and other scriptures, we see that drawing near to God gives us this rest, this rapture, this repose, as we of course continue to march on towards his coming rest in his coming kingdom. So in conclusion, it is hoped that one can see, or one will see, that that drawing near to God provides many benefits. We just covered 4 here in this sermonette series, this 2-part sermonette series. We saw that that by making this acrostic, we saw that 4 benefits of drawing near to God is that number 1, it provides navigation in our lives, because his word becomes our wisdom in the sight of the nations. Then E, it provides us with encouragement, because God tells us not to be afraid, and that if we make his law, again, our wisdom, he'll give us good success, and he will do us good in the end. Then then the third benefit is that drawing near to God gives us an astute apprehension of ourselves, so that the enemy won't take advantage of us, because God will give us tips and say, okay, I know you better than you know yourself. It's probably best to flee idolatry. It's probably best to flee immorality, so that we can always remain near to him and make it to his coming kingdom. And then the R is that, or the fourth benefit, is that drawing near to God gives us a rest and a rapture and a repose, which sees us through all the circumstances that life has to throw at us, and so that we may make it into God's presence and enjoy pleasures forevermore. So I hope that has helped. And the closing scripture is James chapter 4 verse 8, which reads in the New King James, part of it anyway. In the New King James reads, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." Thank you, brother.